Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at New Testament backgrounds. When we talk about biblical backgrounds, what does that term even mean? It's the world in which the Bible took place. After all, here's a famous painting, the painting of the Mona Lisa, and of course, our eyes usually go to her eyes and her face and her features. But if instead of looking at her, if we spent just a few minutes maybe looking at the background of the story, we might see something different. Notice in this picture, the background has two different horizon lines. You've got the horizon on the right, and then it's at a much lower extent. We might look at the way it's formed. We might look at the water in the background. There's a road off to our left, her right. And just look at those specific areas. And what this study is going to do, instead of looking at the Bible, we're going to be looking at backgrounds to the Bible. Now, how do we do that? How do we study backgrounds? Well, we're going to be looking at ancient texts, the primary sources, the people that lived alongside the times of the scriptures when they were being written, when the stories were taking place. We'll also look at some of the historical background, the world in which they lived, the stories of what had taken place in the world around them. We'll be looking at the discoveries of archaeology. We'll go when we can to archaeological digs and examine those. And then we'll connect those stories with the New Testament texts and see how they interrelate and see how they help us to better understand the Bible. Imagine if we were to be able to go back, or not back, forward in history, 2,000 years to the year 4020. And imagine there was at that time a Chinese historian not looking at the history of China, but going back 2,000 years and looking at a history and a culture of a people that were very different from his own. Perhaps he was studying the people of what had back then been the former United States of America. And he might come across this writing, this article. Notice the article, Coach Tim had this to say about Noah's perfect game. Despite the warnings of severe weather, tonight was the best control that I've seen from Noah. Noah was as strong with his fastball at the end of the game as he was at the beginning. Noah was very efficient by locating his fastball the entire game. He kept hitters off balance with his off-speed pitches. Everything was working to perfection for Noah. Now you hear that story. That news article about Noah, his baseball game, and you fill in all the blanks. Notice that the writer of the article didn't say anything about what baseball is, what a fastball is, how does a ball get faster, what is a hitter and who's being hit and who's doing the hitting, what is a pitch and is that the same thing as a pitcher and something that holds water, and how was Noah being perfect? You see, somebody might read this without knowing about baseball, without knowing about fastballs, without knowing all of the background that the original readers would take for granted. And he would have no clue what it was talking about. Likewise, the biblical writings are written with an assumption of a historical background, of a cultural background, of all the things that made up their world. And those things are not explained in the biblical text, they are assumed. We see this when we look at a number of sayings, and I'm going to use maybe some of our common sayings, but not just some of ours, since we picked on China. I'm going to continue for just a moment. Here's a Chinese proverb: the tallest tree will be knocked down first by the wind. Or something very similar to it, the nail that sticks up will be hammered down. Now, we don't usually use those expressions in the West. Instead, we might say the squeaky wheel gets the grease. And that speaks to one of our values. One of the things that we see in our society is speak up for your rights. In China, they have a very different attitude. And you want to see that difference of culture, that difference of perspective. And when we come to the Bible, we ought to remember we're looking at a different perspective that is assumed. We're used to Rene Descartes' comment, I think, therefore I am. In Africa, we might say that very differently. We relate, therefore I am. Again, a different culture, a different mindset. that is assumed by the readers and the writers of that culture. And so we'll be looking at the world in the New Testament that will involve an examination of culture and history, the history of the Jewish people, of the Greeks, of the Romans. We'll talk about chronology and how all these things developed. We'll look at slices of society. We'll examine the Dead Sea Scrolls and the manuscripts, both of those writings and other related writings as well, of the New Testament too. The historical sources and ancient authors will walk around Jerusalem. We'll go on a sightseeing tour, and we'll get to know the geography, not just of Jerusalem, but of the entire ancient world. And we'll talk about the economics. And all of these things will make up the background of the things that were assumed by the original readers. And yet, sometimes, if we don't have those same assumptions, we will miss in a big way what the scriptures are saying.